Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in Modern. Today we're looking at Elementals. Elementals is a slow but high-value mid-range deck that uses Risen Reef and Ephemerate to capitalize on various value-oriented elemental creatures. Risen Reef is the linchpin of the deck. It draws tons of cards, recoups the card disadvantage from revoking creatures, and can help trigger Omnath. The deck is generally slow and unable to win quickly, having no ability to advance its board until turn 4 or 5 outside of Ephemerate shenanigans, instead taking over the late game with superior card advantage. Opening hands with Risen Reef are significantly better than those without, and the deck can fall apart somewhat in its absence. Ephemerate lets you squeeze additional value out of your creatures or save them from dying to evoke triggers. Ephemerating Mulldrifter is another way the deck can get far ahead. Another way the deck can get ahead against small creature decks is by evoking a Fury and ephemerating it early in the game. Otherwise, the deck has a fairly straightforward late-game mid-range plan. Whether you count Elementals as a tribal deck is up to you. The only card in the deck that cares about creature type is Risen Reef and Kahira or Flamekin Harbinger in previous versions. The deck exploded in popularity with the release of Modern Horizons 2, adding the Evoke Elementals into the format. The problem with the old Kahira Elementals deck was that it was mostly just a worse version of the 4-color Omnath deck. While it did generate more card advantage in the late game and had better busted draws with Ephemerate, it was generally much slower and had less ability to interact. Another big issue holding the old Elementals deck back was that it had a lot of bad matchups against top-tier Modern decks, including an absolutely atrocious Crashing Footfalls matchup, one of the format's premier decks. Footfalls is faster, consistently puts up a lot more pressure by turn 3, and has a lot of instant speed interaction for Risen Reef. Then, the matchup got even worse when Footfalls brought in Blood Moon post-board. The only way for old Elementals to win the matchup was busted draws involving Ephemerate on Fury and Solitude or Teferi on the play backed up by pressure. Because of this, the Elementals deck evolved into the 4-color Omnath deck, although some lists are still considered to be Elementals. There are differences between them, namely that Elementals drops Counterspell, Expressive Iteration, and Supreme Verdict for Risen Reef, Ephemerate, and Fury, but the two decks are mostly the same. The major difference is in how they play. Both are go-long mid-range value decks, but 4-color Blink can pivot into the control role, whereas Elementals can play only mid-range. However, Elementals has better value plays due to Risen Reef and Ephemerate. Elementals also has slightly better land sequencing since it doesn't need to worry about having double blue for Counterspell. If you're interested, you can look at my 4-color Blink primer since most of what I said there also applies to the Elementals list. Sideboarding and how to beat it. Most of the Elementals shouldn't be sided out unless they're dead cards, such as Fury and Solitude against decks with no creatures. Omnath in particular always stays in since it generates value and pitches to every evoker, although not necessarily all 4 copies. Besides that, sideboarding is fairly straightforward. Elementals is best against decks that can't keep up with the insane value it generates or which have a lot of creatures that Fury and Solitude kill. Hammer Time in particular is struggling to maintain its presence at the top of the format since its 4-color Blink and Elementals matchup is really bad. Despite being 4 colors, the deck can somehow run Magus of the Moon, which boggles my mind. The main reason is due to Arkham's Astrolabe, Abundant Growth. Magus fights big mana decks like Tron and Amulet Titan, as well as Urza's Saga. The deck is worse against creatureless decks and faster decks that it can't pressure. While not unbeatable, Elementals can have a rough time against Tron and Cascade decks. Tips and tricks. The deck's ability to draw an obscene amount of cards can become a problem since Risen Reef's trigger is mandatory. If this happens, it can be correct to kill your own Reefs with Fury. You can also reset your library with Endurance. If you have Reef and Ephemerate, you should target a different Elemental since Reef triggers from either one entering. Endurance can be shuffled into your library by evoking it and stacking the triggers so that it dies before you shuffle. If you want to trigger Omnath's abilities again, you can reset it by ephemerating it. Risen Reef is a way to trigger the damage portion of Omnath's landfall ability. You can also trigger Omnath's 2nd and 3rd mode at instant speed with Reef plus Endurance or Solitude, or Ephemerate. Creature tutors should most often find Reef since it's so important, but can get other cards like Fury if you need them sooner. Teferi is already a very good card, but here it doubles as protection for ephemerating creatures and can bounce them himself to reuse their abilities. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Elementals. I want to thank my fellow players in the Magic community for whom sharing their experiences helps make these guides possible. You can find additional resources, such as an up-to-date deck list, in the description. If you think I left out anything important or got something wrong, please leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned to see what deck we look at next time.